Good afternoon. My name is Susan Doyle from Box Media, and I will be your facilitator today. I would like to welcome you to Lean Construction Ireland's 27th webinar, the topic of which is Quality Matters, presented by Paul Nash from Paul Nash Consultancy. If you have a question, please type it in the question box and we will consolidate and ask Paul in the second half of the webinar. If there are any questions that we don't get answered during the webinar, we will follow up by email afterwards. This webinar has been brought to you by Lean Construction Ireland in conjunction with Box Media, their media and communications partner. The speaker for today is Paul Nash from Paul Nash Consultancy. In a career spanning over 35 years, Paul has worked for some of the construction industry's leading contractors and consultants and has advised property owners, developers and funders in the UK and internationally. As a past president and fellow of the Chartered Institute of Building, Paul is actively engaged in raising awareness of the key issues affecting the construction sector and regularly speaks at industry events. He is the chair of the CIOB's Construction Quality Commission that is investigating the issue of quality in the construction sector and what needs to be done to improve it, and is a member of the Industry Safety Steering Group that is providing strategic level oversight of the government's building safety programme following the Grenfell Tower fire. He is also a contributor to the CIOB's Code of Practice for Project Management for Construction and Development and Code of Practice for Programme Management in the Built Environment. Paul has a Master of Science in Project Management from the University of Reading and is an alumni of Henley Management College. I will now pass you over to Paul to start his presentation.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you for that introduction. And I'd like to thank everybody on this webinar this afternoon for taking the time to dial in. What I want to talk about today is the issue of quality in the construction industry, and specifically what is being done to improve it. During the first bit of my presentation, I'll talk about the work that's been done by my professional body, the Chartered Institute of Building, and the work that we've been doing specifically to raise standards and promote best practice in quality management. During the second part, I want to go on to talk about the action that's being taken by the UK government in the wake of the Grenfell Tower to improve building safety on high-risk residential buildings. But I'll also look at some of the other quality initiatives that are happening in the industry and how they are helping to raise the bar as well. And finally, I'm going to close by explaining why I think quality matters and why it's important that we all act now to deliver better quality buildings and infrastructure in our industry. This is very much a personal journey for me, and it was a journey that started 2.5 years ago when I was president of the Chartered Institute of Buildings, and it began with this headline. I was invited at the time to a round table discussion in Edinburgh by the Minister for Housing in Scotland, and the report, which had been produced by Professor John Call, was into a defect that led, or a number of defects that led to the collapse of an end wall of a primary school at Oxgang School. It was one of a number of schools. Similar defects were found in a number of other schools in Scotland, all of which have been procured under the same PPP initiative. But the thing that really struck me when I was in the roundtable discussion was this quote from the report: the fact that it was a matter of timing and luck that no further injuries were sustained or fatalities, because if you look at the photograph on your screen, that wall is where children would have been queuing up about an hour later to go into school. So it could have been a very different headline at the time. And I know when I came away from that round table, I felt strongly that this was an issue that we needed to understand more about, how something this could happen. Let's face it, this is very basic building technology. What we were talking about was a lack of wall ties and a lack of head restraints in a cavity wall. But actually also within the report was reference to the lack of fire stopping in the building, which was another defect which could have made the building dangerous in the event of a fire. Shortly afterwards, this headline appeared in the news, which stated that Bovis were having to set aside £7 million to compensate customers for poorly built homes. And of course, this is an issue that still resonates today within the house building sector. At the time, the interim chief executive issued this statement, acknowledging that there was a problem with their production processes. And essentially what he was saying was that time and cost were being prioritised ahead of delivering good quality homes. And then shortly afterwards, this report was published by YouGov on behalf of the housing charity Shelter, which identified that more than half of new build homes in England had major faults. And the faults were ranging from fairly minor issues with finishings or unfinished fittings through to major faults and faults with utilities. But there was one particular quote in the report that I would like to share with you. And that is this, that the current speculative system of house building was failing families by producing expensive yet poor quality homes. And for me, this resonated with a theme that we were exploring at the time, which was to do with our social responsibility as an industry and the need for professionals to act in a socially responsible and ethical way. And then on the 14th of June 2017, the fire at Grenfell Tower happened. And I'd like to play you a short newsreel.
The fire was all-consuming, devastatingly quick, and it was the worst fear of residents who had raised general concerns about fire safety in the past. Why were they ignored? The investigation will likely focus on the cladding, which experts believe accelerated the blaze. Rain screen cladding, curtain wall facades and replacement windows were all fitted to improve the thermal insulation and modernise the look of the building. Right now, there are many questions, but very few people willing to give answers.
We realised as a professional body that we had a responsibility to act at this point in time. So we decided to establish a commission of past presidents to investigate the issue of quality in construction and what needed to be done to improve it. We wanted to focus in particular on the need to establish and promote a culture of quality, instilling pride in the building's infrastructure that we create. But we also understood that in order to do this, we needed to better understand the behaviours, both at an individual and a corporate level, that were either promoting or preventing the delivery of quality on construction projects. And it was important to us that we did this in a way that was evidence-based, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. So having established commission, we set out our terms of reference. The first of these was that we wanted to work to improve the quality of people, process and product, whilst recognising the constraints that operate within the industry and throughout the construction process. We wanted to encourage a new quality culture, instilling pride in the work of the industry. We recognised the importance of education and training. We recognised also the role of other key stakeholders in the industry, including government, clients, designers and contractors and other members of the supply chain. But also we realised that we were working within an industry where there are a number of constraints, specifically in respect to the quality of people, the level of training and the availability of skills, and also the underlying issue that our industry has with fragmentation in the supply chain. We were very keen when we started out to ensure that we didn't make any assumptions about what the underlying issues were. What we really wanted to do was ensure that we had a reality check before we decided what action we were going to take. So in October 2017, we issued a call for evidence, and we wanted to hear from our members and the wider industry about the issue of quality and what needed to be done to improve it. And in February of 2018, we published the findings from the call of evidence, and I'd like to share those findings with you now. The first thing we looked at in the questionnaire was the management of quality, and we asked the question, do you believe that the current management of quality is adequate in terms of supervision? The response was significant. 76% of our respondents said that they did not believe that the current management of quality was adequate in terms of supervision. We looked at sign-off. Even more significantly, 84% of respondents said that it was inadequate in respect of sign-off. And we looked at workmanship. And in this case, 82% of respondents said that the current management of quality in respect of workmanship was inadequate. So we knew that there was evidence here to support the view that we had, and there was an underlying issue with the industry in respect to the management of quality. We then looked at regulation codes and standards. And we asked, do you think that existing regulation codes and standards are adequate to achieve good quality construction? The response here wasn't quite as significant, but it was still the majority of respondents, 55%, said that they did not think that existing regulation codes and standards were adequate to achieve good quality construction. And finally, we looked at education and we asked, is construction quality taught effectively in educational establishments? In this case, 74% of respondents said no. And we also asked about certification systems and whether they were fit for purpose. And again, the majority, 54%, said that they were not fit for purpose. So at this stage, we had some data to support the evidence that we already were collecting, which suggested there were some underlying issues in terms of the way that quality was both managed and taught in our industry. Some of the key points that came back in the written responses were things like there was too much reliance on paper-based quality control procedures to maintain quality on site, a lack of site supervision by designers and engineers. Interestingly, the decline of the clerk of works role was seen as being an issue, and this lack of an assigned responsibility for inspection and sign-off. Recognition also that regulations are important, but compliance only constitutes the minimum standard, which was something, interestingly enough, that was also identified by the Building a Safer Future report that came out in the wake of the Grenfell Tower fire. There was a need to strive for better quality, to go beyond the codes and standards if we were going to deliver buildings that were to the required quality and that were safe. Something else here that I felt personally was quite important, having started my career on site, was a recognition that there is a need for people to get experience on the job to supplement any classroom teaching. It's not enough just to rely on what you can learn in the classroom. And finally, this recognition that there was too much of a focus on the bottom line, which meant that there was inadequate resources allocated to quality on site. So this was some of the evidence that we were collecting from our call for evidence. And these are some of the quotes. These were things that were said to us in the responses, and I wanted to share these with you because, again, some of the key words keep recurring here. This idea that cost is the main decider and that pride and professionalism have taken a back seat. This need to make it personally, to generate a culture of pride. And also this recognition that any change needs to start with a change in corporate culture and that there was a need for a behavioural change that comes from the top down. In addition to the call for evidence, we also conducted desktop research, some of which looked at how other countries managed quality. And as you can see from this heat map that's been produced, we see a wide range of different approaches to quality and the way in which quality is managed. And we also looked at other industries as well to see how they approach quality and quality management. So having conducted the call for evidence and having looked at the desktop research, we'd pulled all this together. We looked at the reality check, we'd done learning from overseas, and we'd looked to learn from other sectors. And what this did was it highlighted 4 key areas that we needed to investigate and improve. One was education and training and knowledge, legislation, codes and standards, inspections and sign-off, and the need for greater consultation and cooperation, both between other professional bodies and government. Or as one respondent put it, a joined-up approach across all major industry bodies is needed if we're going to truly tackle quality. As a result of this work, we identified 3 recommendations. We wanted to create a quality code that would capture best practice and set the standards for the industry. We wanted to develop a competency-based quality certification, and we wanted to ensure that quality had a greater emphasis in the CIOB's own education framework. So what have we done since? Well, in 2008, September, the CIOB Academy launched a 2-day course in construction quality management. The aims of the course are to understand the fundamentals of quality management, to demonstrate knowledge of the theories, principles and processes, to recognise the difference between quality control and quality management, to demonstrate knowledge of the various legislation, codes and standards, and to apply quality management best practice in construction in terms of both processes and attitudes. The course is still continuing to run, and as all the courses to date have been extremely well attended, and the feedback that I've had personally from those who've attended the course has been very positive as well. In September 2009, we published our new Code of Quality Management. It was a result of 2 years of work and extensive research and industry-wide consultation. We put early drafts of the code out to industry, and we collected their feedback, and we incorporated that into the final document. The code has 6 sections, and essentially it splits into 2 parts. One which sets the background to quality and covers the research that was done, the findings of that research, and a number of other initiatives that are happening in the industry. But the bulk of the document is a quality management plan, which endeavours to set out standards with reference to the relevant codes against each element of the building. And I must emphasise at this point, the intention of this document is that it is a practitioner's document. It's a tool to be used by people in the industry and to help them to better manage quality on construction projects. It is free. It's available to download at a website, which I can share afterwards with people if they're interested. But the intention is that the code is not going to sit on people's shelves. It's a document that we want people to engage with and to give us their comments on going forward. And then later in the next month, in October, our plan is to launch what's called a quality MOOC. A MOOC, for those who are not aware, is a massive open online course. It's free, it's available for anyone to participate online. This particular course will run over 3 weeks and requires probably no more than a couple of hours in each week. It's a combination of videos and course content and reading. But I think the real value from my experience of doing these courses is the ability to interact with people online through an online forum. So again, I'd encourage people on the call to try it out when it's launched. Look out for the launch. As I said, it is able to access a lot of people, and the intention of this really is to get people engaged with the issue of quality at the first level, because over time what our intention is to build on this through the 2-day course. And then later on this year, we'll be launching a pilot of a quality certification scheme based on the Code of Quality Management. The model for this has already been set. We already have a certification scheme for building conservation at the CIOB. And to some extent, what we're endeavouring to do here is to replace some of the lost skills and knowledge with the decline in the clerk of works role in the industry. And I very much see it as an opportunity to raise the bar in terms of standards of training and skills around what I think going forward is going to become an incredibly important role in the industry. So I've talked a bit about the work of the CIOB. I've talked about the journey we've been on for the last couple of years. And it's been an eventful journey. I've learned a lot along the way and continue to learn. But I also started this by talking about one of the key events that informed our decision to start on this journey. And of course, that was the tragic events of the 14th of June, 2017 at Grenfell Tower. I've been very fortunate over the last 2 years to have become involved with the work of the government's building safety programme, and I'll say a little bit more about that as we go through these next few slides. But I want to share with you the work that's being done to try and ensure that there is never another Grenfell Tower. So the building safety programme was set up in the first place to ensure that the residents of high-rise residential buildings are safe and feel safe now and in the future. And to date, the work has involved the ongoing replacement of cladding. As we know, initially that focused on ACM materials. More recently, there's been a review of high-pressure laminate materials as well. So that work is ongoing. It was followed a short while afterwards by a ban on combustible materials. As some of you will be aware, there was also an issue with GRP fire doors and the testing of fire doors, which the government has also been working on. And importantly, and I'll say a bit more about this in a minute, there's been a review of competencies across the industry. But also alongside this, there was an independent review of building regulations and fire safety, which was undertaken and led by Jane Judith Hackett. I was personally involved in one of the working groups that informed that report. My group looked into the issue of procurement. There's a link there, which I'm happy to share after the presentation with people if you want to find out more about the work of the programme. The government issues regular bulletins and updates on the work they're doing. I wanted to talk obviously about the Building a Safer report, which came out in May last year. The report, which was quite hard-hitting actually, identified 4 key issues. It identified issues around ignorance, indifference, a lack of clarity on roles and responsibilities, and inadequate regulatory oversight and enforcement. But this quote in particular struck me from the report, and of course this was the first time that we saw the phrase which has now become quite commonly used about the race to the bottom, the lack of a focus on delivering the best quality building possible to ensure that residents are safe and feel safe. In December 2018, the government published its implementation plan based on the Building a Safer Future report, and effectively it backed all the recommendations in the report. In some cases it even went slightly further. As part of this, the government established an Industry Safety Steering Group, and the purpose of the Industry Safety Steering Group, which reports directly to Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government, was to provide strategic level oversight of the work that was being done through the Building Safety Programme and to challenge where necessary. I'm very privileged to be a member of that group. It is a very broad group in terms of its membership. There's representation from a number of other industries, including the aviation sector, the oil and gas sector and chemical sectors, and the British Standards Institute and Health and Safety Executive. So there's a broad view of opinion on the group and a lot of constructive challenge as a result of that. The plan also announced an early adopters programme, which was designed to trial and test some of the recommendations. And I've listed there some of the companies that are currently participating in that programme. In June 2019, the government launched a consultation on the implementation plan. That closed on the 31st of July, and I'm expecting shortly to hear an update on the feedback from industry and those who responded to the consultation. And then in August 2019, the Competence Steering Group published its interim report entitled Raising the Bar. And the purpose of this report really was to set out the measures that the group were recommending needed to be taken to improve competence of those who design, construct, inspect, maintain and operate higher risk residential buildings, what we now refer to as HRRBs. And it's a significant piece of work. There is a lot of work ongoing in each of the working groups that inform that report, and there is a process of consultation that's now happening. There are 2 consultation workshops, one happening on the 30th of September and one on the 18th of October. Now I want to talk a bit about some of the key points in the consultation briefly, because there are a number of key and I think significant points which will impact on the way that our industry operates going forward once they become legislation. The first thing here is that the proposals apply to all multi-occupancy residential buildings of 18 metres and above. The original report, the Building a Safer Future report, actually set the bar at 30 metres. So the government went further than Dame Judith in this respect by setting the bar at 18 metres. There's a new system of gateways that will be introduced with this recommendation. And these gateways require sign-off at a planning stage, before you start construction and before you occupy the building. So these are key gateway stages where the client and their advisors will need to demonstrate that the building complies with all the requirements in terms of building safety. And then during the occupation phase of the building, there'll be a requirement for a safety case. The new system will introduce duty holder roles. Now, 2 of those roles are aligned with the existing construction design management regulations, that being the principal designer and principal contractors roles, but those roles will be extended. There will be a register of those who are qualified to work on HRRBs going forward. But there are also 2 new duty holder roles. And these relate really to the ownership and the management occupation of buildings. An accountable person will be someone who is named on the board of a company who will be responsible ultimately for the building safety of their buildings. And there is also a role of a building safety manager. And a building safety manager is a role that is essentially intended to ensure that when modifications or improvements of buildings are done during their life cycle, that safety considerations are considered and that the required regulations are complied with. The accountable person will have a legal responsibility to register buildings in scope. There's also a requirement in the consultation to create and maintain and hold a digital golden thread of building information as well. Drawing on the model that's used in the engineering sector by the Institute of Structural Engineers, there's also a requirement being introduced for mandatory compliance reporting, as well as whistleblower protections as well. And I think I want to emphasize a bit of this point about the importance of whistleblower protections, because it was something we highlighted on the procurement working group that I chaired that informed the original report. Because one of the concerns that was highlighted early doors was that there are a number of decisions being made where people probably did know that there were consequences of those decisions, but didn't know how to escalate those concerns or raise those issues. So I think this is an important part of the legislation that was being discussed currently. An overarching competency system will be introduced, and this will be required to essentially implement the recommendations of the Raising the Bar report that I mentioned earlier. There is a lot of work that's been done and still a lot of work to do to raise standards of competency across the industry. A new role is being created of a building safety regulator, and this role, with a department behind it, will be required to provide oversight of the new system. But they will also have powers of enforcement and sanctions as well. And I think this is important because I think what we're seeing here is a recognition that much in the way that health and safety legislation works, we need this role to have teeth and to have the ability to enforce and, where necessary, take action where rules and regulations are not being complied with. And finally, a recognition here that it's important that residents have a quick and a clear route to escalate any concerns. And of course, this is directly taken from the experience of Grenfell Tower fire, where one of the issues that was identified was that residents had raised concerns with the tenant management company, but nothing was done about it. So in this case, whilst there is absolutely a responsibility on the accountable person to communicate with residents and to listen to their concerns, there's also a direct route to the building safety regulator if residents feel those concerns are not being listened to. Now, I mentioned also that I would talk about some of the other quality initiatives that are happening in industry. And the Building Quality Initiative is something that was kicked off just over 2 years ago. And it's a joint initiative by the RIBA, the CIOB and the RICS. And essentially what this was a response to a concern that had been highlighted by the architects, that the current system, particularly of design and build, led to a reduction in quality when the architect who originally conceived the building and obtained planning for it was then not continued into the construction phase. And whether you agree with that view or not, it was identified as a concern, and there was a view that there would be value in trying to create what is referred to as a chain of custody by using the RIBA plan of work. It's a good piece of work. It is being trialled on a number of projects by certain clients at the moment. And if you'd like to find out more, I've included a link on this page where you can go and download the pilot. Another initiative which I've been really impressed with is the Get It Right initiative. And this started about 2 years ago and did some research into the cost, really, direct costs of what they refer to as avoidable errors during the construction or the design and construction of a project. The figures are significant, as you can see from this. I mean, and I think basing their model on the work they've done subsequently on this, I think they've really made good progress in terms of trying to raise the bar and provide better education through the work they're doing, particularly with the CITB. But their main focus is around improving productivity and quality through the elimination of waste. And again, I think if you're interested, I've included the link to the website. They've just refreshed and updated their website. There's a lot of good material there, and I'd encourage you to go and have a look at that. And something that's a bit of a hot topic at the moment is the issue of sprinklers. It was back in March that actually, again, a joint initiative between the RSS and RIBA and CIOB, we issued a statement where essentially what we were saying is that there needed to be harmonisation within the UK, because currently the threshold for sprinklers in Scotland, Wales and England is very different. And as you can see here, the lowest of these is 11 metres, which is in Scotland. Having issued the statement, we waited to see if anything would happen. And then on the 5th of September, the government issued a consultation proposal suggesting that the trigger height for sprinklers was reduced to 18 metres, but also recognising that the trigger height in Scotland and Wales is lower, and asking for views on that. If anyone's interested particularly in that, again, if you go onto the government website, you can download the consultation document and see the recommendations that they're considering. So there's a lot of work going across the industry at the moment, a lot of initiatives, and also, encouragingly from my perspective, a lot of collaboration around what we see as key issues for our industry and more widely for society. And I'd like to really finish this presentation today by saying a little bit about why I believe quality matters. And the first thing I'd like to say is that what we do as an industry matters both to society and to the economy. We create the places that people live and work and play in, and buildings they go to learn in and to heal in as well. So what we do as an industry makes a difference. But when we get it wrong, the impact on people's lives and their livelihoods can be massive. The tragedy of Grenfell Tower is something that none of us would ever want to see repeated, and it demanded that we took action. But over the last couple of years, I've been struck also by the effect that poor quality has on people in their everyday lives as well. One of the stories I read of the young family still trying to get a builder back to make good defects on a new home 1 year after they've moved in, defects that should never have been there in the first place. So for me, this is not just about doing it right, it's about doing the right thing. And that for me comes down to a matter of ethics. And ethics is something that I believe defines what it means to be a professional. This was something that I was quoted as saying not that long ago, because, you know, for me, the responsibility that we all have, professionals, both for the reputation of our industry, but also for the well-being of those who use those buildings that we design and we build and we manage. Yes, there's been some good progress, but I believe there's still a lot of work to do. And what I'd like to do really is finish with a quote from the father of quality management before we move on to any questions and answers. William Edwards Denning, who was quoted as saying that quality is everyone's responsibility and we never have to stop getting better. So thank you all for listening, and I hope you found that presentation informative and useful, and I'd be very happy to answer any questions if anyone's got any.
I'd like to thank Paul for his very insightful presentation, and as he said, we'll now move on to the Q&A. We have several questions already in. Paul, culture and behaviours are words that feature strongly in your presentation. How much do you think that the industry needs to change, and do you think it can change?
That's a very good question, Susan. I think what our research identified was that there was an underlying cultural issue in the industry. Ultimately quality was being sacrificed for time and cost, and of course that was something that was covered also and identified by the Building a Safer Future report, what Dame Judy referred to in the report as the race to the bottom. There is a recognition that I think more widely now that there needs to be a change in attitude and behaviours, and that's both from the top down and from the bottom up. What is clear, and you know, when I talk with Dame Judith, you know, she's very clear to industry that we shouldn't be waiting for legislation to make that change. We need to be getting on with it now. And I do sense within the construction industry, when I talk to people, that people get that they know that's what needs to happen, and they are acting to improve quality on their projects and take the steps that are necessary. Ultimately, we have to wait and see. I'm an optimist. That's to some extent way I approach most problems. I think from that point of view, when I see the response to the presentations I'm giving to the and the people I speak to more widely out there in industry, I do believe that we will change as an industry.
Okay, excellent. Another question from an attendee. Of the measures you have outlined, which of them would have made the most difference in the Grenfell Tower case?
Oh, gosh, that's a good question. I think candidly, I'm going to probably say, when I talked about whistleblower protections, I think I'm going to say more widely, any measure which allows somebody to stop and say, actually, we need to understand this problem. We need to understand the consequences of some of the decisions we're making better before we sign them off. Because I think one of the problems I've seen in industry is, and it comes back to this issue of fragmentation, but it's also driven by, to some extent, responsibility and what responsibility will people take, indeed what their insurance will allow them to do in some cases, is people taking responsibility for what's going on and standing up and saying, hang on, that's not right, or that's not good enough. Not hiding behind a scope of service or their PI and saying, well, that's not my responsibility. And I do feel quite strong. This is why I talk a lot about behaviours and culture and about professionalism, because I think, in the case of the Grenfell Tower fire, and actually, if I could go up before that, if I go back to Edinburgh Schools, which is a good example, the thing that really struck me when I was at that round table was, on that project, it's very easy to focus on the bricklayer. It's very easy to focus on the bricklayer and foreman or on the construction manager on that site. All of those, yes, should have said, hang on, this isn't right. But if you look at that project, there would have been a whole team of consultants walking onto that project who would have seen very visibly what was going on. And I think if you carry that, and yet didn't say anything, and I think there was a regulatory process in place. There was building control, Scottish Building Control were involved in the project. So what went wrong in the system, but also why did nobody put their hand up and say, whoa, hang on? And I think that does uncover a much wider range of issues around, not just about people taking responsibility, but do they have the knowledge, do they have the expertise to make those judgments? I feel certain, and we'll see, because the second phase of the judicial inquiry, the more big inquiry into Grenfell, kicks off in January, which is looking specifically at the events leading up to the fire. The first stage looked at the fire, the day of the fire itself. But I suspect one of the things that will be uncovered from that is that somewhere along the line, someone said, we can provide a cheaper cladding solution, and that will help you hit your budget. And whoever procured that said, great, go ahead and do it. Nobody stood and said, well, we need to think this through. So I hope that answers the question, because it's an important question, really.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Another question: cost continues to be driven by the client, who will look at the lowest price. How do we push the drive? How do we push the drive for a quality product?
That again, very, very good and very important question. I have a view on this, and my view is that, again, it comes back to this issue of responsibility and people as an industry being prepared to stand up and say, actually, there is a consequence of this. I gave an example recently. I sat in a meeting with a client not that long ago who had just been told that his project was going to cost, I'll throw a number in there, £40 million, and he had 30 million in the budget. And he said, well, that's not good enough, we've got to get it down to 30 million. I said, well, I just want to say, a £30 million project is a different project. You don't get a £40 million project for 30 million. And say we don't get a £4 million project, 3 million or whatever. So I think there's a bit of a reality check here of saying to people, and this comes back to responsibility of professionals as well, to turn around and say, to their clients, okay, one thing that our industry is good at is proposing solutions. We're good at problem solving. So if the problem is that you've only got that much budget to make this work, then we need to look at how we can value engineer in the true sense of the word, the project, to achieve that. But don't think that just by cutting cost, you're going to get the same quality of standard of building. And more importantly, and I think this comes back to the issue around legislation and regulation, I think we're going to see more and more tightening up of that. So it's going to be incumbent at the end of the day for clients and those who advise them to turn around and say, okay, we have to comply with legislation, we have to deliver a good quality building, and in order to do that, we need to be honest with you. You can apply the same to timescales. If it takes 18 months to build a building, it takes 18 months. Yes, there are ways of fast tracking or crashing a program, but that has potential consequences as well. So I think there's an element of honesty and telling it as it is. To be honest, that I use an example when I talk to people. If you'll indulge me a second, this year was the 50th anniversary of the moon landings, and I was doing some. Like a lot of people, I was following some of the coverage on the telly, and I picked up on a talk that was given, or speech that was given by Gene Kranz. He was the flight controller for the Apollo program, and in the before the Apollo 11 landing, the Apollo 1, there was a fire. 3 astronauts lost their lives in that fire, and he turned around, and if anyone's interested, look it up. It's called the Kranz dictum, and it resonates with a number of the questions we're having in industry, because effectively he turned around and said, we're all responsible here. None of us stopped and said, we were so focused on getting this over the line, getting an astronaut into space. None of us stopped, and none of us actually stood up and said, damn it, stop. And I heard that, and I thought, that's exactly the kind of language, to some extent, that we need to be bold enough and brave enough, I think, to use here. We need to be prepared sometimes to turn around and say, stop. This is not the right way to be going here. So I hope that helps in answering the question.
Yeah, I think so. Another question: how important is product/component provenance in determining quality?
Extremely important. In fact, there's a whole piece of work that's been done and being done by the BBA, British Board of Agreement, and by the Construction Products Association to tighten up on all of that. Interesting enough, within the recommendations, there is a suggestion that there might be an independent regulator for construction products as well, because I think there's a recognition of how important this is. And it was interesting because the BBA and the CPA both presented to the steering group a few months back, and they were completely aligned in terms of recognizing that there needs to be a step change in the way in which products are certified, and in how they are. That process then sees itself through to the site. But I think one of the more interesting things, which is a bit of a recurring theme here, was there was a recognition that they were certifying individual products in isolation, whereas in reality, we know buildings require a number of components to come together. A cladding system is a great example. So they were saying that now they kind of put their hands up to that and said, we're certifying individual products, but actually we need to be looking at buildings as a system, and we need to look at individual systems within that building and certifying the system, which might be a composite of a number of different certified components. So I thought that was quite an interesting recognition from those bodies.
Absolutely, yeah. Another question, a couple more for you. Value engineering has come in for a lot of criticism recently for focusing on cutting cost at the expense of quality. Do you think this criticism is justified?
I sort of touched on this earlier, didn't I, really, when I said that VE, if it's done as it's intended to be done, i.e. focus on delivering the same or a better performance for the lowest cost, there's nothing wrong with it. I've used VE on a number of projects very successfully. The problem only arises when the term is used to refer to what is essentially cost cutting to achieve a budget, and where there's no consideration on the impact on quality and performance of the building. That's really the underlying issue here. I think this is an area, and I know there's been, inevitably, as soon as anyone puts their head up the parapet and says that value engineering is the problem, people jump up and say there's nothing wrong with value engineering. I actually support that view. So the problem here is there's an education required by the industry in terms of explaining to client what value really is, and it's not just about cutting cost.
Okay. Another question. Your research highlighted that the decline of the clerk of works role was seen as one of the reasons why the industry was failing to deliver the right standards of quality on site. How important is the need for independent quality inspection, and how do we restore these skills to the industry? Again,
a very good question. I mean, my view is important. I think certainly in the UK, the current system has relied too much on self-certification. And I think the evidence really has shown that we can't rely on that, which underlines the benefits of having an independent inspection and certification role. Certainly where I've seen clerk of works on site recently, and I had a project in Edinburgh where we interviewed 3 major contractors, the response was unanimous. They all valued having the clerk of works on site. They welcomed it as providing sort of an extra pair of eyes on the site. So, I mean, construction managers have got a lot of spinning plates to deal with. So having someone who's also looking at quality for them is seen as helpful. I do think also that there is, I mean, one of the problems at the moment, candidly, is I think there is going to be more demand for independent certification and inspection. I think the issue at the moment is that, as anyone who's tried to employ clerk of works knows, they're like hen's teeth. They're going to become very popular. And so I think there's a real opportunity here for us to utilise existing skills in industry and upskill people to do that role from a range of different disciplines. I mean, we could have people coming straight into the role, or at the other end of the spectrum, I was talking to a construction manager recently who's nearing retirement. He's been over 40 years in the industry, and I said to him, any thoughts what you might want to do? He said, well, I don't want to retire, he said, but I'd quite like to do his clerk of works role. So I think that's one of the motivations behind us introducing this quality certification scheme, is to try and provide a route for people to become qualified and provide that role on projects going forward.
Okay, we just have another question in here. Sorry, it's quite long now. You mentioned that education and training are key to achieving quality outcomes. Do you think the dependency on the sector on SME contractors is a barrier to this?
That's a very, very good question. One of the things that I think, I mean, I recognise that there is an issue because it's expensive to. It's a big investment for SMEs to put into training and development. Candidly, it's one of the reasons why I wanted to make the code of practice and the MOOC available for free, because I didn't want cost to be a barrier to anyone, but in particular SMEs who are ultimately the backbone of our industry. I didn't want it to be cost to be the barrier that would prevent them from engaging and using that material. I think it's an important area that we need to look very closely at. I mean, we haven't got to the point yet of looking at what as a professional body we would charge for the certification scheme. That there is a precedent to this. I think the interesting question it raises for me, and this comes back to CITB, who presented to us last time, the Consultancy Training Board, is they receive government funding. So the question, I guess, going forward for us is, to what extent is that funding going to be directed towards making this sort of training that I'm talking about available and accessible to anyone, and in particular to SMEs going forward. So I think that's a big question there around government policy, the role of CITB, but also the role of professional bodies and what we can do to make this type of training accessible, because it is so important. It's so important that we, one of the things that came out of the research that we did at CIOB when we did the call for evidence was, and I touched on it when I said that this approach, the paper-based approach to quality management, is that in the universities they don't really teach quality. They teach about ISO 9001. They talk about the standards, the regulations, but they don't teach the methodology, what it actually takes to deliver a quality building on site and how to recognise poor quality. And I think that's a failing, and it's a failing that, to be fair, I think the academics I've spoken to have recognised. So, it's really important that we get back to a place where we combine experiential training on site with classroom training, and give people the skills to be able to not just to deliver good quality in the first place, but also to recognise where there are issues of poor quality and rectify that.
Absolutely. Thanks for answering all the questions, Paul. We've no more questions left. I'd like to thank Paul again for his presentation. A copy of this webinar will be sent out to everyone who attended. The next webinar will take place on the 30th of October, the topic of which is the 5 S's, deliver more value with less waste, and will be presented by Dennis Swords from Quality Support Services. We will send out the information shortly via LinkedIn, Twitter and newsletter. I would also like to thank Graham and Dennis Leonard, a Lean Construction Ireland board member from Graham, for helping make this webinar happen today. Thank you again from Paul and myself on behalf of Lean Construction Ireland. You can follow Lean Construction Ireland on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook and through the website leanconstructionireland.ie. Enjoy the rest of your day and be lean.